The dinner table was set for 12 people, and the conversation had the particular quality that holiday dinners have when everyone present is performing a version of themselves that is slightly more agreeable than the version they carry through ordinary days. The wine was good, the food was good. My daughter Natalie was at the far end of the table laughing at something her husband had said, and she had the look she gets when she is genuinely happy rather than managing the appearance of happiness, a distinction I have learned to read over 38 years of being her father, and that I have always found more important than most things. Her husband Brandon Kerr was at the center of the table doing what Brandon did at every social gathering I had observed him in over the 4 years since he had married my daughter, which was performing. Not dishonestly, not maliciously, simply in the way of a man who had grown up in a house where status and presentation were the primary languages, and who had absorbed those languages so completely that he no longer distinguished between performing them and living them. He was telling a story about his father's company. He was telling it with the easy confidence of a man who expects the room to be impressed and who has received enough confirmation of that expectation over the years to have stopped questioning whether the impression is accurate. His father's company. I sat at my end of the table with my glass of wine, and I listened to the story, and I did not say anything. I had not said anything about this particular subject in 4 years. I was very good at not saying anything about it. I had had a long time to practice. My name is Raymond Osei. I am 67 years old. I was born in Accra, Ghana, came to the United States at 23 on a fellowship to study business and finance at a university in North Carolina, and decided within 2 years of arriving that this was where I was going to build my life. I earned my MBA, spent 7 years in corporate finance at a regional bank in Charlotte, and then in 1989 did the thing that everyone I knew at the bank considered premature and that I had been planning carefully for 3 years, which was to leave and invest in a portfolio of small and mid-sized businesses that I believed were undervalued and undurled, and that I could help grow through capital and operational support. I was right more often than I was wrong, which is all you need to be in that business if you are right by enough of a margin, and if you are patient enough to let the right decisions compound over time. I was patient. I was disciplined. I did not talk about what I was doing. I have never talked about what I am doing. This is a habit so deeply embedded in how I operate that my daughter Natalie, who is 38 years old and whom I love completely, does not have a full picture of my financial position, and has never asked for one because she was raised to understand that a person's finances are their private concern, and that love does not require a financial accounting to be genuine. Brandon had not been raised with that understanding. Brandon had been raised to understand that a man's worth was something that was established and communicated and defended publicly, and that the absence of public establishment was the same as absence of worth. This misunderstanding was, as it turned out, the central fact of our relationship, and the thing that made the dinner table story both predictable and quietly, completely wrong. Kerr Industrial Supplies was founded in 1981 by Douglas Kerr, Brandon's father, as a small wholesale distribution business serving industrial clients in the Carolinas. Douglas was a decent businessman with good instincts for client relationships and a reliable operational sense who had built something solid at modest scale over 15 years. By 1996, the company had 12 employees, 3 warehouse facilities, an annual revenue of approximately $4 million. It was also, by 1996, carrying debt that its cash flow was struggling to service because Douglas had expanded the warehouse capacity in 1994 in anticipation of demand growth that had not materialized at the rate he had projected. I became aware of Kerr Industrial through a business broker contact in Charlotte who knew I was looking for precisely the kind of situation Douglas was in, a good company with a good foundation that needed capital and financial restructuring rather than a new direction or new leadership. I met Douglas Kerr in October 1996 at his main warehouse in Charlotte. He was 61 years old and had the directness of a man who had stopped pretending things were better than they were because pretending had stopped being useful. He showed me his books. I spent 2 weeks with his books. At the end of 2 weeks, I made him a proposal. I would invest $2 million in Kerr Industrial in exchange for a 58% ownership stake. The investment would be used to retire the existing debt and provide working capital for the growth that the warehouse expansion had been intended to support. I would be a silent partner. Douglas would continue to run the company. Profits would be distributed according to ownership percentage. The company's name would not change. My involvement would not be disclosed publicly. Douglas agreed. We signed the papers in December 1996. Brandon Kerr was 11 years old. I want to describe what 27 years of silence about a significant financial position actually looks like in practice, because it is not what people imagine when they imagine it. It does not feel dramatic. It does not require constant vigilance or elaborate management. It requires simply that you do not bring it up, which is easy when you have no reason to bring it up and when the people around you have no framework for asking about it. Over 27 years, I attended annual reviews of Kerr Industrial's financials with Douglas, and then, after Douglas retired in 2011, with the management team Douglas had installed. The company had grown steadily under the operational structure we had established in 1996 and the subsequent refinements. By the time of the holiday dinner, the company had 64 employees, 8 warehouse facilities across 3 states, annual revenue of $31 million, and a valuation that the most recent independent assessment had placed at between $22 and $26 million. My 58% ownership stake was worth between $12.7 and $15 million, depending on the assessment you preferred. Brandon Kerr worked in his father's company as the head of business development, a position Douglas had created for him when he joined the company at 26, and that had grown in scope and title over the years, without growing proportionally in actual operational authority, because the management team Douglas had installed were competent professionals who did not require Brandon's direction to do their work correctly. Brandon believed he was central to the company's success. He told this story at dinner tables. He had been telling it for years. I had been listening to it for 4 years. I had not said anything. I want to be fair about Brandon because fairness is a discipline, and because he is my daughter's husband, and because some of what he was doing was simply what people do when they have been raised in a particular kind of house and have internalized its values without examining them. Brandon thought I was a retired bank employee who had done reasonably well for himself and who lived comfortably in a paid-off house in Charlotte on a pension and some savings. He had asked me once, in the first year after he and Natalie married, what I had done in my career, and I had told him I had spent time in banking and then in private investment, and that I had retired from active work some years ago. He had received this as a description of modest professional success and had filed me accordingly. He was warm to me in the way of a man who is warm to people he has categorized as unthreatening and who do not require careful management. He complimented my cooking when I cooked at holiday gatherings. He included me in conversations at a level appropriate to someone he had assessed as intelligent but not professionally significant. He told me once that his father's company was going to be very valuable someday, a statement delivered with the particular unself-consciousness of a man who does not realize he is telling the future majority owner of the company in question that the company is going to be valuable someday. I said that sounded promising. He said his father had built something special. I said Douglas was a good businessman. Brandon looked at me with a brief expression of mild surprise at the familiarity of the reference and then moved on. I did not explain the familiarity. I refilled my wine. The dinner I described at the opening of this story was not the first time Brandon had told stories about Kerr Industrial at a table I was sitting at. It was, however, the first time the story he was telling had direct relevance to a decision I was in the process of making about the company's future. Douglas Kerr had called me 3 weeks before that dinner. He was 79 years old, and his health had been declining in the way that health declines in the late 70s, when a body has been well maintained, but has reached the point where maintenance alone is not sufficient to hold the line. He told me he was thinking about the company's future and that he wanted to have a serious conversation about what the next 5 years looked like. He mentioned Brandon. He said Brandon had been pressing him about formalizing his role in the company's ownership structure, and that he was feeling pressure to bring Brandon in as a co-owner in a way that would change the existing arrangement. He said he wanted my input before he made any commitments. I told Douglas I appreciated the call and that I would come to Charlotte the following week. I drove to Charlotte. Douglas and I sat at his kitchen table for 3 hours. I told him what I thought about Brandon's operational contributions to the company based on the annual reviews and the management team's assessments. I told him what I thought about formalizing an ownership position for someone whose contributions had not yet been proportional to the ownership stake he was seeking. I told him that whatever he decided about Brandon's future in the company, I wanted the existing ownership structure protected and documented, and that I would be engaging my attorney to ensure that any changes to the company's structure included appropriate provisions for the existing shareholders. Douglas nodded throughout. He said, "Raymond, I have been meaning to have this conversation for 2 years." I said, "I know, Douglas. I have been waiting for you to be ready." My daughter Natalie knew that I had investments. She knew I was not a man of modest means, in the way that Brandon's categorization suggested. She knew this not from any specific disclosure I had made, but from the accumulated evidence of a lifetime of observation, the way she had grown up, the house we had lived in, the education I had provided, the manner in which I had always handled financial matters with a calm that is only available to people who have a sufficient cushion beneath them. She had never pressed for specifics because she was her mother's daughter in the respect for privacy, and her father's daughter in the understanding that a person's financial life is their own. What she did not know was the specific nature of my connection to Kerr Industrial. She did not know I had been a majority owner of her husband's father's company for 7 years before she met Brandon, and for 11 years before she married him. I had not told her because it had not been relevant, and because I protect the privacy of my business relationships as a professional habit, and because I had not anticipated that her marriage would make it relevant. I was reconsidering that position in the weeks after my conversation with Douglas, not because I wanted to create a dramatic disclosure, because Natalie deserved to understand the full picture of her family's situation before decisions were made that would affect it in ways she could not anticipate without the information I had been withholding by omission. I asked Natalie to have lunch with me on a Saturday in January, 6 weeks after the holiday dinner. We went to a restaurant we had been going to together since she was in college, a quiet place where the tables were spaced well and the service was attentive without being intrusive. We ordered, we talked about her work. She was a pediatric occupational therapist, and the work was both demanding and meaningful in the way that work is meaningful when it involves children. We talked about her children, my 2 grandchildren who were 7 and 4, and who were the best evidence I had that the world was going to continue to produce people worth caring about. Then I told her. I told her the full story from Douglas's warehouse in Charlotte in October 1996, through 27 years of silent partnership, through Douglas's call 3 weeks before the holiday dinner, and my visit to his kitchen table. I told her what my ownership stake was worth. I told her what the conversations about Brandon's proposed ownership position had involved, and what my concerns were. I told her I was sorry I had not told her before her marriage, and that I had not withheld it to deceive her, but that the habit of professional privacy had operated in a space where it should have been overridden by the more important obligation to make sure she understood the full context of the life she was building. Natalie listened to all of it. She was quiet for a long moment after I finished. Then she said, "Dad, how long have you been sitting at holiday dinners listening to Brandon talk about his father's company?" I said, 4 years. She looked at me with an expression that contained several things simultaneously. The surprise of new information, the recognition of something she had sensed without knowing, and a particular kind of amused exasperation that she has deployed since she was 14 years old, when she feels a situation has been handled in a way that was technically correct and humanly absurd. She said, "Dad," I said, "I know." She said, "You have to tell him." I said, "I know that too." Before I told Brandon anything, I called my attorney, a woman named Caroline Osei, who had handled my investment portfolio's legal matters for 22 years, and who had been the attorney on the original Kerr Industrial transaction in 1996 and every subsequent document related to it. I told her about Douglas's situation and Brandon's pressure, and my conversation with Natalie and what I was planning to do. Caroline said, "Raymond, before you have that conversation, I want to make sure everything is documented in a way that leaves no ambiguity about the existing ownership structure and your rights within it." We spent 2 weeks ensuring that the documentation was current, comprehensive, and resistant to any interpretation that might be attempted by people with an interest in a different interpretation. The original investment agreement from 1996, the subsequent amendments and profit distribution records, the most recent independent valuation, the correspondence with Douglas about the proposed changes to the ownership structure, and my formal position on those proposed changes. Caroline prepared a summary document that laid out the ownership history and the current structure in language that was clear to a non-lawyer, and that established, beyond any reasonable question, what I owned and what I was entitled to, and what could not be changed without my consent. She said, "This is a strong position, Raymond." I said, "I know, I just wanted to make sure it looked as strong on paper as it is in fact." She said it did. I asked Douglas to arrange a meeting. Douglas understood what the meeting was for without requiring a full explanation, because Douglas had known for 27 years that this moment was theoretically possible, and had always understood that, when it arrived, it would require his presence and his candor. The meeting was at Douglas's house, Douglas, Brandon, and me. No attorneys in the room, though Caroline was available by phone if needed. Brandon arrived not knowing what the meeting was about. Douglas had told him only that there was an important conversation about the company that needed to happen with all relevant parties present. Brandon came in with the alertness of a man who senses significance without knowing its direction. He sat across from Douglas and me. Douglas opened the meeting. He said, "Brandon, there is something about the company's ownership structure that I should have told you years ago, and that Raymond and I have agreed it is time for you to know." He said it plainly and with the directness of a man who had been carrying something for a long time and was relieved to set it down. Then Douglas looked at me. I told Brandon the story from 1996. I told it in the same way I had told it to Natalie, completely and specifically, and without dramatizing it because the facts were sufficient without dramatization. I told him about the warehouse in Charlotte in October, the 2 weeks with the books, the proposal, the 58%, the 27 years, the current valuation, my ownership stake. Brandon sat across the table from me, and his face went through changes that I observed with the attention of a man who has spent a lifetime reading rooms, and that I will not describe in specific detail, out of respect for the fact that some moments of private reckoning deserve privacy, even in a story that is being told publicly. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "You own most of my father's company." I said, "Yes." He said, "You have owned most of my father's company for 27 years. I said, "Yes." He said, "And you have been sitting at my dinner table for 4 years. I said, "Yes." He looked at his father. Douglas said, "I should have told you sooner. I am sorry for that." Brandon looked at me again. Then he said something I had not anticipated. He said, "Why didn't you say anything when I was talking about the company?" "Why didn't you say anything?" I said, "Because it was not necessary until it was necessary, and now it is necessary." What had become necessary was a clear and documented conversation about Brandon's proposed ownership position and what it would and would not include given the existing structure. Caroline joined by phone and walked Brandon through the ownership summary document she had prepared. She walked through the existing shareholder rights and the provisions governing any changes to the ownership structure and the protections that were in place for existing shareholders. Brandon had brought the proposal he had been developing with Douglas to the meeting. It was a proposal for a 30% ownership stake to be transferred from Douglas's existing 42%. The proposal did not reference my 58% or require my consent because Brandon had not known my 58% existed. Caroline explained what consent was required for various structural changes under the existing agreements. She explained it professionally and without editorializing. Brandon's attorney, whom Brandon called from the meeting and who joined by phone, reviewed the summary document and asked 4 questions, each of which Caroline answered specifically and completely. Brandon's attorney said, "Brandon, the existing structure is clear and well documented. Any changes to the ownership structure will require Mr. Osei's consent and participation." Brandon looked at me across the table. He said, "So what do you want?" I said, "I want the company to be managed well and to continue growing. I want whatever changes are made to the ownership structure to be made thoughtfully and with full information and in a way that is fair to Douglas and fair to me and fair to the company's employees and clients. And I want to be part of those conversations going forward rather than learning about them after they have been discussed at dinner tables." Brandon was quiet. Then he said, "I understand." I believed him. It has been 8 months since that meeting at Douglas's house. Brandon and I have had 4 subsequent conversations about the company's future, each one more direct and more substantive than the one before it. He has asked me questions about the 1996 investment and about how I had identified the opportunity and what my analysis had been. They were good questions, specific and intelligent, the questions of a man who is trying to understand something he had not understood before and who has decided that understanding it is more useful than resisting the discomfort of not having known it. I have answered every question honestly. Douglas's health has stabilized somewhat, and he is less pressured about the succession timeline than he was 6 months ago, which has allowed the conversations to happen at a pace that is productive rather than reactive. A revised ownership structure is being developed that will bring Brandon into formal ownership in a way that reflects his actual and prospective contributions, and that protects the existing shareholders appropriately. Caroline is managing the documentation. I am involved in every step. My name is no longer a background fact about the company. It is a present fact, and I am comfortable with that, and I believe Brandon, over time, is becoming comfortable with it too. He has not told the Kerr industrial story at a dinner table since January. I have not asked him not to. Some adjustments happen without requiring instruction. Natalie and I had coffee 2 weeks after the meeting at Douglas's house. She asked me how it had gone. I told her. She listened with the attention she brings to things that matter, and when I finished she said, "Dad, can I ask you something?" I said yes. She said, "Did you ever think about telling him before the marriage?" Before they got engaged, I thought about that honestly. I said, I thought about it. I decided it was my business information and that it was protected by the same professional privacy I applied to all my investments, and that the marriage was between you and Brandon and not between me and Brandon's father's company. She nodded slowly. She said, "And now," I said, "now I think there was a conversation that should have happened earlier, and that I am the one responsible for it not having happened, and that I am glad it has happened now even if the timing was not ideal." She said, "He is going to be okay, you know. Brandon, he just needed to recalibrate." I said, "I know, he is asking good questions." She smiled. She said, "He told me you know more about the company than he does." I said, "I have had 27 more years with the books." She said, "Dad." I said, "I know." We finished our coffee. She hugged me at the door. It was the hug of a woman who loves her father and who has just learned something significant about him that confirmed rather than complicated what she already knew. I drove home. I sat on my back porch. I thought about Douglas in his warehouse in October 1996, showing me his books with the directness of a man who had stopped pretending. I thought about how far a good decision, made honestly and held patiently for 27 years, can reach. It can reach all the way to a holiday dinner table. It can reach all the way to a meeting at a kitchen table where a son finally understands the full picture of his father's company. It can reach all the way to a Saturday morning coffee with your daughter where she calls you dad in the tone that means she sees you clearly and is not troubled by what she sees. That is as far as a good decision needs to reach. My name is Raymond Osei. I am 67 years old. I came from Accra at 23 with a fellowship and a discipline and a habit of privacy about my financial affairs that has served me for 44 years, and that required once to be set aside in the interest of a more important obligation. I invested in a warehouse business in Charlotte in 1996 because the numbers were good and the man was honest and the opportunity was real. I held that investment in silence for 27 years while my daughter grew up and fell in love and married the son of the man whose business I majority owned. I sat at holiday dinner tables and listened to stories about the company and did not say anything because there was nothing that needed to be said until there was. When there was, I said it. The room recalibrated. The conversations that needed to happen are happening. The documentation is in order. My daughter knows the full picture. Her husband is asking good questions. Douglas is at his kitchen table in Charlotte with his health holding and his company in good hands, and the knowledge that the investment he accepted in 1996 from a man he met once before trusting him with the majority of what he had built was the right decision, and that the man has been worthy of the trust for every one of the 27 years since. I never told my son-in-law I owned the majority of his father's company. When I finally told him, neither of us needed it to be dramatic. The truth was sufficient. The truth is always sufficient when it has been prepared correctly and delivered honestly and held for exactly as long as it needed to be held. If this story reached something in you, leave a comment below. Tell me where you are watching from. Subscribe if you have not already. Topic 2 is coming and it will not disappoint.